I've got a big one for you today. We're about halfway through the life of Rise of the Floodborn, and I've got an insane meta report, lots of decks to go through. I've got some up-and-coming decks, some decks that are kind of dropping off, and I've got just the decks that aren't really changing too much. Let's just jump right into it. Now the first deck, and the reason you probably clicked on this video, was Weight Set. This deck got top 8 at PPG Orlando, and it's a very interesting and unique deck. I've not seen Weight Set used at all in my locals or on Pixelborn or anything like that. This is just a massive breath of fresh air in a Ruby Amethyst meta. Basically, we're going to use a load of vanilla mid-range tools with 4 attack to just draw some cards. Against aggro, we shouldn't have too many problems because of course we are playing steel, so we can just clear their board that way. And then against control, we have the beast to kind of combo off. Overall, this looks like a really interesting deck. If you guys want to take this to your locals, it looks pretty cheap. The only expensive cards are going to be the beasts, and even they are quite cheap these days. But definitely a deck to try out if you're a bit bored of the stale meta. So next up on the up-and-coming, I've got Emerald Steel Discard. This is probably the most toxic deck I've ever seen or played against in my whole life. Basically, we're just going to completely control the board, slow our opponent down, and discard all of their cards, and then just slowly win the game that way. We use cards like Prince John as our draw engine. Every time we discard a card, we get to draw a card. And cards like Bucky to make sure our opponent has no way to play the game. It's a pretty solid deck. It seems to be kind of taking the ladder by storm at the moment. It has a lot of good matchups, and if it high rolls, then there's nothing your opponent can really do to get back in the game. They are just kind of in top deck mode, and if your opponent doesn't really have much card draw in the deck, then you kind of just win out from there. You have a lot of card advantage with cards like Donald Duck and Beast, and you can control the board quite a lot with cards like Tinkerbell and just the overall steel cards that we know and love, like Grab Your Sword. I do have an in-depth guide coming out for this deck very soon, so if you're excited for that, make sure to keep an eye out. The deck hasn't really got too many tournament results, but it seems to be just a typical lad deck where if you can get your cards at the right time and you sequence them correctly, your opponent just doesn't have a way to play the game and you can slowly win out that way. There are loads of ways to discard cards from your opponent's hand. And like I say, if you've got Prince John on the field, you're going to be refilling your whole hand at the same time, so there's not really much your opponent can do, and you should just generate a lot of card advantage that way. Next up on the up-and-coming list, we've got Steel Sapphire. This deck kind of looks like the evolution of Pawpsicle. We've seen Pawpsicle kind of fall out the meta a little bit, but I'll talk about that in a moment. Steel gives you another draw engine and a whole new world, and it gives you a lot more board control with Tinkerbell and cards like Cinderella. And when we combine it with Sapphire, we have ways to ramp up to our expensive units. We have a whole new world as a draw engine, and we just have the overall removal of Sapphire with Hades and Let It Go and things like that. And it just makes for a really good mid to late game deck, where you have a lot of resources to deal with cards that your opponent's playing, and you just have a lot of ways to generate a lot of card advantage. Cogsworth is another really good inclusion in this deck, as it gives all your cards resist +1, so your opponent's going to have quite a difficult time if they're playing steel clearing your side of the board. Amethyst Steel was one of my personal favourites in set 1. It took a lot of skill to play, but if you could pull it off, then you could get some really insane wins against a lot of the decks. In my opinion, this deck is probably top 3, as long as you put the games in and put enough time in practicing and making sure that you know the correct lines of play. We see the return of Elsa, Spirit of Winter. This card is fantastic, especially with the new bounce tools, as you can keep replaying it. Bounce seems to have breathed a lot of life back into this deck, and it plays a lot like Ruby Amethyst, but you kind of just have like slightly different lines of play with the steel package. It's a lot better at clearing kind of wider boards, but overall, if you enjoy Ruby Amethyst but you're quite bored of it, then maybe give this one a go. It's a lot more skill expressive, but in my opinion, it's kind of near the same power level. So finally, for the up-and-coming decks, I've got Mufasa. I didn't know whether to put this one in up-and-coming or in no changes, because it's kind of old at this point, but it's kind of new at the same time. Again, I'm just going to quickly plug, if you haven't seen the Mufasa guide that I posted, it'll be in the description, a lot of good stuff in there. But anyway, this deck basically just wants to cheat out huge units and just gain really unfair advantages that way. It plays like your typical Ruby Amber mid-range deck, apart from there are the odd chances that you get to high roll. It's probably the most fun deck you can play right now, so if you haven't played it already, definitely give it a go. If you want to play it in person, it might be a little bit expensive, but just give it a go on the Pixelborn ladder, see if you can get some really insane games of it. And it's an absolute blast to play. It has a lot of good matchups, and it can really cheat a lot of games if you can hit the right cards off of Mufasa. Overall, this deck is definitely one to keep an eye out going forward. Okay, so out of the 5 decks I just spoke about, 4 of them are steel, so of course the first deck on our dropping is going to be Hyper Aggro. This deck just absolutely folds to steel, and steel is everywhere at the moment. I like to say that Hyper Aggro is a meta-cool deck, and right now the meta is not in favour of it, so I wouldn't recommend taking it to any tournaments. You can still get away with some free wins on ladder. Until steel kind of calms down a little bit, I wouldn't recommend playing Hyper Aggro. Obviously, it's a really fun deck to play and you can get a lot of games in. So if you enjoy it, definitely still play it. But I think if you want to be super competitive right now, there's too much steel for Hyper Aggro to exist. On the note of steel, I've got Amber Steel in dropping. And that's simply just because of the absolute rise of Ruby Amethyst recently. Ruby Amethyst absolutely destroys this deck. And as well, Amber Steel is a very typical mid-range deck, so there's a lot of other steel decks running around that kind of beat it. Overall, this deck is still fantastic. I still think this deck is top 4 for sure. But I think Ruby Amethyst is so dominant currently that this deck is going to require a lot of luck in dodging the control matchups. Speaking of the control matchups, I've also got Pawpsicle in dropping. Pawpsicle just doesn't really have a win condition, and I think that's fine at the start of the set because people are still discovering a lot of new things. But right now, it seems to just be outclassed by all the other control decks that we have, aka simply just Ruby Amethyst. While it does have the game plan of wanting to go late, it doesn't really have a solid game plan other than just use Be Prepared on turn 7 and just drop a big Tamatoa. And against Ruby Amethyst, they're going to clear that a lot of the time, and then you don't really have anything to follow up with other than just drawing loads of cards. The deck also loses to Aggro, which we have seen a little bit of. Like I say, it is dropping as well. So if you want to play Pawpsicles, maybe take a look at Steel Sapphire, as I think that might be the new way to play Pawpsicles, and it seems just a bit more consistent and a bit more reliable. Okay, so I've got 2 decks in the no changing. The first deck is Sapphire Amber. I think this ink combination is just going to be like a super reliable ink combination, super consistent, super skill expressive, and very honest deck. Like I say, it doesn't really do anything too crazy. It just kind of does what it does. It's just a run-of-the-mill mid-range deck. If you can get ahead early, then you're probably going to win. If not, you're probably going to lose. There are definitely better decks out there, especially for Sapphire. I would rather just play Sapphire Steel, and for Amber, I'd rather just play Amber Steel. So it seems like Steel is just the way to go, honestly. Sapphire Amber doesn't really have enough board clears to really be reliable. Your only board clears are just really expensive cards. And you're going to have a hard time playing against decks that are clearing your board from turn 3 onwards when you're waiting until turn 5 to use One Let It Go, which is also ramping your opponent. But overall, the deck is still a ton of fun, so definitely one to keep an eye out of. And if you're bored of the current meta, definitely give this one a go. It's pretty solid. And finally, we've got Ruby Amethyst. Don't need to say anything about this one. I've got the deck in no changes. It's the #1 most played deck. It's the #1 in the power rankings for the decks. Overall, it's just an absolute powerhouse of a deck. And everyone's kind of bored of it right now. It's topping all the tournaments. It's doing everything that a deck wants to do. It is just the deck to beat currently. So that's been it for my meta report. We've got lots of up-and-coming decks to keep an eye out of. Lots of fresh decks for the meta. We've got a couple of old favourites dropping off. And we've got some decks that just refuse to change and refuse to drop out of the meta. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.